The poets tell us that all past is prologue, so to know what Marcellus was will tell us what Marcellus is. And to know what Marcellus is will show us what Marcellus will become. Please join us as we look at Marcellus past.
In the spring of 1857, we started from Michigan, intending to go to Iowa. But as Joseph had a number of relatives here we were visiting, they thought we had better stay. We are still staying. Uncle Cooper came after us with a big wagon. I don't remember of riding in one ever before, but nothing else would have stood the road. The nearer we came to Marcellus, the worse it got. The road from Howardsville was simply ridiculous. Over the roots of trees, in one hole and out of another, mud nearly up to the axle tree.
My grandfather, when he was a little boy, played with the Indians here, and in fact, at one time his father lived with the Indians at one. And one time, Granddad used to go play with the little chief, with the chief's little son, and one day he stayed too long and he was afraid to go home. So that the old chief took his little son and Granddad and walked him home to where the Creamery Creek come in. The Rocky River is where the Indians used to come in the spring and then twice a year, in the spring and the fall. When Granddad was a boy, they got their groceries in Three Rivers, and they used to, there was no roads, and they went down the river. And they would buy probably 10 pounds of tea or 20 pounds of coffee and get their staples and bring it back by boat. And another thing Granddad was told about, that the Indians cooked everything in a pot, in an iron pot. And they said that they would take the muskrat and put him in there and his tail would hang over. And another thing he said that we always laughed at, the Granddad always, if like a kettle of beans or anything, he'd take a big old scoop out and he said, dig deep, get more dog. You bet that they ate dogs too, and the meat and everything go through the bottom of the kettle. So you dig deep, you get more dog.
And went to the local country school called Crumley School. My mother went to school there when she was a kid, and I can remember her telling that she was frightened one day when an Indian on his horse come charging up and yelling out the door, and apparently the tribe used to live in the area, and they came back to go to the mill pond to pick up willow to make baskets, which they sold in the fairs and so on.
My ancestors on my mother's side were Bears, and my great-great-grandfather was Joseph Bear, and he migrated up to White Pigeon from Clinton County, Ohio in 1836. And he knew a man in White Pigeon that bought the land that was being surveyed here in Cass County. And he come over here around Marcellus and bought land. He was a great hunter and trapper, and he wanted land near lakes and rivers. And in 1836, he bought the land where we're on right here, right now.
My grandfather bought this land on which we are sitting, 211 acres, because he had heard that there was going to be a train that came through town, and he was an entrepreneur. I guess one couldn't give it any other name, and he foresaw that it would be a wonderful site for a community. So he came here and bought a farm from a man by the name of Pulver. It was 211 acres. The farm had a house on it already, and it would have been in back of us. It would lie directly between the stone house and this house. And he began his life here. He was a farmer, And where the Hudson building is now were his barns. There were 2 large red barns. He was a very successful farmer, and he dealt in not only selling his own products, but he would help other people sell and market theirs. So he was very successful.
While we were kids there, one of the things we used to do spring and fall was go back to the Rocky River. There was a swimming hole there and do a little skinny dipping. Didn't happen too much when I was there, but apparently it happened before, and apparently the kids weren't too particular, boys or girls. They all went skinny dipping and had a good time. And the well was a hand pump outside. In the wintertime, there was a well pit there, and they had to release the air pressure, which was done down the well. A kid had to go down there and release it so the pump wouldn't freeze. And then in the morning, they'd go and close up the valve and prime the pump, and they'd bring the water in a bucket, and we all drank out of the same dipper. But I think it was Mrs. Miller decided to be a little more sanitary, and we each had to have our cup, but we still dumped into the same bucket and drank the water. And when Mrs. Miller was there, she started warm lunches. We had a round stove right in the middle of the school, and in the wintertime and cold days, we all huddled around the stove. And so she brought a kettle of, and each of us brought vegetables, and we'd dump it in, and we'd have a warm noon meal. This is a picture of the old schoolhouse, and the woodshed was on the front, on the west side, and there's a door, the door that they threw wood in. It was sort of a trap door type, or a swinging door type thing. It was never locked. And the door into the schoolhouse from the woodshed was never locked. So 2 or 3 times, some of us on a Saturday or vacation would climb into the schoolhouse and fill the boards with a lot of graffiti of one sort or another that sort of irritated the teachers.
Oh, well, I taught our school there for 2 years, and the first year, of course, this was Depression time, and the first year I got $30 a month.
35.
30. In a country school, the teacher got up and got there early and swept the floors, or she did it the night before, and got all her lessons planned and things. And you had all these different grades. You didn't have more than 10 minutes for a class. And then the youngsters would help at a lot of little things, but you had everything, you taught everything practically. As the grades got older, you taught different things. And
You had to build your own fires. They didn't have.
oh yes, you had to build your own fires.
Keep the fire up.
Yeah, nobody built the fires for you. Well, in each special class, sometimes you might have 1, you might have 4. It just depended how many were in that time.
Starting out, our first teacher was Mrs. Shaw. And then from Mrs. Shaw, we went into Mrs. Fredlin. Then she got married, and then her name was Mrs. Kent.
Oh, right.
That would be the 2nd and 3rd grade. Is that not right?
I thought Mrs. Brucker was the 2nd, 3rd grade.
No, no.
Anyway.
Then we went from there to Mrs. Holliday's room,
Holiday.
and that was an adventure. This was an adventure. If anybody talking about school abuse or anything like that or learning, well, when you went to school to Mrs. Holliday, she had a hickory club about that long, and it was used anytime she wanted to, and nobody said anything about it, because if you said anything about it when you went home, you got twice as bad. But
the building, it had wooden floors. It was a 2-story structure with a basement. We were the Marcellus Rural Agricultural School, and 20 outlying school districts started to become consolidated with the Marcellus district. And as Mr. Jensen was the superintendent, he outlined that the last annexation was one of the highlights of his career as a superintendent.
Well, the story that my mother tells is that she looked out the window one day, and here my father was in his three-piece suit and his spats and his derby hat, walking down the street with this herd of cattle because they were driving the cattle out to the farm. And she said she'd never seen a more handsome man in her life. Well, he at the time, interestingly enough, was doing business with the First State Bank. How she ever captured him to come into her bank, I don't know, but she did.
Farmers used to go out west and buy cattle and ship them in uptown here to these stockyards and take them out on their farm and finish them out. And I think some of them did sheep too, lambs, bought carloads of lamb. And I remember one time somebody had shipped in a carload of horses up there, and they auctioned them off.
I must mention, in the 30s, they had a couple of picnics, what they called the farmers and the merchants picnics. And my father wanted to go to it, and that was not like him at all. The only place he ever went much was church and family reunions, but he wanted to go to that picnic, and I was teaching. I was home for the summer and had a car, so I took him, and there I met my husband. So that was an important occasion too.
Saturday night was always a big night in Marcellus. Everybody went to town on Saturday night. You got to see everybody, and everybody bought their groceries and done their shopping on Saturday night.
I was visiting with my cousin, and she was recalling when she came to visit her grandpa and grandma, who lived south of Marcellus by the creek. And they came into Marcellus in a Model T4 that had no sidings, had a roof or ceiling. But her grandma would bring the eggs and the butter, and they would go in the grocery store, and they would be traded then for things that her grandmother needed to supply our kitchen. And and then she said that they would just visit with all the people. There were benches out in front of the stores that people would sit on, and then people would go by and you'd visit for hours. And that was their big afternoon and evening.
And then another highlight was going down on Main Street on Saturday night, and the farmers would come in, and like you say, they parked their horses, some of them back of, the farmers would come into town on a Saturday, and that was when the town boys looked everybody over pretty good because they was kind of invading our property. Or not that, but they'd be in there and you'd be eyeballing them and stuff like this. But then at Saturday night, old Van Valkenburg had an old shop. Then every Saturday night they'd have dances. But the first thing I remember about that was, and it's one of the first times I heard radio, was when they had the Max Schmeling and Joe Louis fight, and he had it on the radio, and he had speakers he'd put up on both sides of that old porch. It had a veranda on it when he then he had put music on, and I remember some of the dancers at that time, and I think some of the finest dancers I seen out there was Elmer and his wife, Elmer Michael and his wife. They were really good dancers, and I think old Russ Galehouse and his wife they always danced out there, and Riley Pyle.
And Riley Pyle used to call square dances.
Yeah, and we used to go and we always watch them people, and we'd say, "Holy smoke, is that something else?" You know, I mean, this is entertainment.
Yeah. In the wintertime, when I was about 4 years old, they had ice houses back of the, all these store meat markets and the restaurants and everything like that. And Dad would go before daylight out to Big Fish Lake, and they would cut ice and they would haul it into town. And then it'd be dark by the time he got home. And all the ice houses are all gone now.
Oh yeah, Saturdays. Of course, Saturdays was shopping day in Marcellus in the beginning when I was little. But as I grew older, then Saturday night everybody went in for celebrations, and it was a busy town. It was just real busy, and they had movies, of course, and everybody just met all their neighbors in there, and it was an interesting evening always. That was your vacation, your recreation for the week.
Because you go through Marcellus, and you still do. There was always a train go through. I don't care how long, if you was around there 2 minutes, there was a train go through. And the horses could come up here, and that train would come where they get up on their hind legs sometimes. And you had to stop and once in a while and get out and get a hold of their bit to kind of quiet them down.
And I got the idea that I wanted to raise Carpathian walnuts. We call them Carpathian walnuts because originally they came from that area in Europe. And when I come home from World War II, the idea bugged me so. But I didn't have any money, and I didn't have a farm. The family farm was tied up, and I couldn't get to it. And I was helping my uncle plant Christmas trees, and I got the idea of planting a lot of Christmas trees. I could borrow money to buy land to raise Christmas trees, but not to raise walnuts. That was too far out. So I bought 140 acres down by Jones, and had Gerald Waltz build me a planter, and then I imported seed, or I bought it from seed sources. It was imported from Europe. Well, I planted these trees on the land that I had bought and planted black walnut in between, and managed to pay for the farm with the Christmas tree money and have a little left over to experiment with. We sell to nurseries, and we have sold to stores and so on. I see. But we sell darn near a ton out our kitchen door every year. Really?
We started raising turkeys, I think, in, I think it was 1926. I ain't sure about that date, but we ended up with running the Shannon Turkey Farm between I and my son.
Farmers used to go out west and buy cattle and ship them in uptown here to these stockyards and take them out on their farm and finish them out. And I think some of them did sheep too, lambs, bought carloads of lamb. And I remember one time somebody shipped in a carload of horses up there, and they auctioned them off.
I came to Marcellus in 1943. My parents were Byron and Beulah Hibbard. My dad was a railroad man, and so we lived along the Grand Trunk. We moved from Hazlitt to Swartz Creek and then to Marcellus. And my dad was a station agent here. Some of the things that I can remember about the railroad is that there were 2 passenger trains that stopped in Marcellus. One around noon was number 20. And then there was one that stopped going to Chicago the other way around 6:30, something like that in the afternoon. And my mom always planned her meals around those trains. If they were early, we would eat afterwards. If they were late, we would eat before. My sister Mary Quinn and I, if we'd go to a dance and stay out too late, in the morning my dad would get us up the first thing and make us wash the station's windows.
Well, you know, it was a white night. Tice White Night used to have a mail truck, and once every night, around 6 o'clock or sometime like that, 5, 6, why he had this pickup, and he used to hire kids to throw this mail on the mail car, and then they'd throw the mail off. A lot of times, if it wasn't fast enough, they'd be throwing mail off, well, this whole block down through here, and you'd have to go pick it up. LMA's dad told me that when he worked on a railroad during the Depression years through here, the people used to shovel coal on the engines. Had orders to, when they got any of these towns, they was ordered to shovel the coal out the door.
So people could come and pick it up.
But my father told me about the railroad company moving the depot that was originally located east of Maple Street and between there and Snyder Street on the south side of the track. I think there's some big maple trees in there now. And it was just the depot part, the west part as we knew it over here where it was located. And they slid it out on the tracks. It was double track then, so you had the width of 2 tracks, and they slid it out on the tracks on heavy planks, and then they hooked a little donkey engine on it, and they slid it right up the track, up to the spot where it is now there by, what, Bernie and Dibble or something. Yeah, okay. And then they put the warehouse on the end of it for the freight. Before that, the freight business, you had to be there and pick it up. And one time the freight business was pretty good because they had local 2 ways, one each way each day.
But they always said that when a train stopped and Marcellus to let off or pick up passengers, the guy could run over to John to get his hair cut and get back to get on the train in time. So he was pretty swift.
And as far as businesses up here on Main Street, that has changed a lot over the years. Up here where the Speedy Mart is now, there used to be a big hotel sat in there on the corner, big 3-4-story hotel. And I believe it was, if I remember right, it was known as a Walker Hotel.
Hogs have been an important item in the economy of the Marcellus area since the early pioneer days. Almost every farm family had a sow or two and raised enough pigs so that they would have for their own use and hopefully have a few extra that they could sell or barter or trade for other items they needed. And almost every farm home did their own butchering, and in the fall of the year, when the hogs were butchered, you had a large kettle or tank that you put the hogs in boiling water, and then the hair was scraped off, and then the hogs were butchered. And since there wasn't any refrigeration in those days, a lot of the parts of the hog were smoked, like the hams and the bacon and the jowls and even the hocks. And other parts were canned. Even the pig's feet were pickled. That used to be one of the favorites. They made use of the hog in the same way the Plains Indians did with the buffalo. They used every part of the animal. Some people said they used every part except the squeal.
A couple of farmers, my father-in-law, they got the idea that they would be easier to raise pigs. They just bred several sows, quite a few, and put them out in the field. They had fields that was natural shade, maybe a water hole, and they'd put them out there in the summertime, let them farrow, and then gather up the pigs for whatever they got. And usually could buy some corn from other farmers and fed them out. And it started out that way. And I started farming with my father-in-law, and this is the way they were doing it. Well, we'd go out there in the hot summer, and you'd find a litter of pigs that the sow would farrow up on the hill on the open at night while it got hot in the daytime, and she would leave them. And of course, she would lose it till all the pigs would be dead. And so we got the idea of building a shelter, just a common lean-to shelter about 6 by 8 that we could pull over a sow when we found one that burrowed in the daytime and protect her from the sun. And this worked real well, and then we found out that we had to get water up there too. So we fixed up water out of an old truck and the old fuel tank hauler and put water tanks out in the field and hauled water out to the field. And this made it much, much more successful. At that time also, the feeding them, they didn't have any way to grind feed particularly, so they would buy some soybean meal and what they called tankage or meat scraps and put it in a feeder and then just put out ear corn in a pile. And that's the way we fed them. Don McKenzie was a big hog farmer, and he ended up tripping over to Europe. And the farmer over there was using what there was sort of huts that they used in the World War. Was just a piece of Quonset hut. And he got the idea those are a lot easier to use than these homemade shelters that we made out of sheet metal and wood. And put those out there and they could move them around. And when they did that, then they could buy those fairly cheap and so some of the people were farming several times a year. And so it made the pig population really grow in this area. So it's Michigan, Cass County was of course considered a hog area of Michigan.
Hi, my name is Ed Reed. I grew up here in Marcellus. My father was actually a machinist, and I went to school to be an electrical engineer. And I actually practiced as an engineer for about 7 years, and I married the farmer's daughter, and now I'm a hog farmer. The reasons for putting together a complex like this is that the productivity that we get out of the sows, she is the factory. And the more pigs that we can get out of that sow in the shortest amount of time is really what the goal is. And you need to be able to produce hogs on a weekly basis in semi-load lots in order to capture market share. The old practical spring pig, fall pig system really covered the market up 2 times a year, in the spring and in the fall. And both of those periods, you usually see a significant drop in market price. By producing pigs every week, you smooth out your cash flow, and you're able to supply those hogs on a weekly basis. Very close proximity to each other. One pig gets sick, so they all get sick. And we're also, the problem with bringing disease in from other hogs, other sources, aerosols. I guess that would be our biggest problem. We typically keep our sows for 5 parities, 5 litters of pigs. And we kind of have a policy that unless there's some real reason to keep her after 5 litters, we go ahead and call her out. And as far as productivity goes, we're getting someplace around 2.3, 2.4 litters per year out of each sow.
This is a picture of G.W. Jones. One of the pictures that probably show him younger than most of them we have around. I can't tell you what date that picture was done, but he was the founder of the bank. He founded the bank in 1877. He really wasn't overly active in the bank. He was more of a farmer and an entrepreneur. But his son Kit's real name was Carroll Sherman Jones. He was the son of G.W. Jones. Not the oldest son. He had another son named Frank who was about 3 years older. But it's my understanding that when G.W. started the bank, Kit became the cashier and the main operator of the bank. So from 1877 until about 1916, he was probably the mainstay of the bank and the main person in charge of operating the bank. And he liked it to be known as a bank of good service. He was very proud of the bank, and he was very concerned about the welfare of the people in the area. Kit was getting he wasn't too well, and Donna had graduated from the University of Michigan and had majored in Latin. She was going to be a Latin teacher. Her mother insisted that she come back and help her father, which she did. So from 1916 to about 1983, July of 1983, she was probably the mainstay of this bank. She was the one who ran it and operated it, even during the Depression. My father tells the story that during the Depression they had a large amount of cash on hand, and there used to be tables that ran off here to the east side of the bank, and they stacked those tables with cash, so that during the Depression, when people would come in and think that their money was in jeopardy, they would see all the cash on the tables and they weren't worried. So they left their money here. We never had a problem, and Donna was able to meet all the demands. In fact, my father and Donna tell stories of lending money to people back during the Depression that probably wouldn't have gotten money if they hadn't been here. Years ago, people used to bring their mint oil into the bank, as I understand it. That was a real valuable commodity at those times. And in order to leave it, they'd either leave it here for safekeeping, or they would take a loan against it and leave it as security for that loan. And the mint oil has a very good smell to it. We still have in the basement a small bottle of mint oil, and we keep it down in the vault down there. And it's just interesting to smell it, but it's just a little tiny bottle that's been left there probably now for 60, 70 years. There have been 5 generations that have worked in the bank. When you think of G.W., who started back in 1877, probably wasn't too active. Then his son Kit and his son also Frank worked in the bank. Frank was the president, but Kit was the cashier and probably the chief executive officer. He worked in there till about 1916, 1921 when he died. When Donna Schurz took over, that would have been the 3rd generation. She and my father worked here up until 1983. He didn't start until about 10 years after she started. Then Abigail Stan, who's Donna's daughter, that would have been the 4th generation. She worked here as a little girl on up to becoming vice president when her mother was in charge of the bank. After I graduated from law school in 1964, I started working here in the bank. My brother Dan Jones has also worked in the bank all of his life. When my children became of age, Christina and Jennifer say that when they were in about the 3rd or 4th grade, we started them coming up here filing checks and working here. Christina now works as the manager in Cassopolis. That's the 5th generation. My daughter Jennifer works here part-time in the bookkeeping department. Also, Abby's daughters, Sarah Essex and Kay McAdams, both worked here as young ladies. So we've had 5 generations. We're looking forward to the 6th generation to come to work here.
Bert Streeter used to have a store just the other side of the flower shop up here. And I went in there to see about getting a ring, because we were going to get married in about 2 days after we made up our minds to it. So he didn't have a regular wedding ring, but anyway, we had a ring there that had a set in it. So Hank bought that for me it was only $7, but it was just as good as a wedding ring because I still got it.
Father had Van's radio shop. I think he might have started it around 1927. He had sold and repaired radios. We had the building next to the village hall, but he was very much interested in anything electrical. And so he had a PA system, and he would broadcast radio shows. And on fight nights, that was the middle of the week, and oh boy, it was just like Saturday night, and the cars all parked diagonally, you know, and the whole town would be just full of people, and especially in front of the radio shop. I don't know if the wives came, but the men came to hear the fight because not everybody had radio. Then later he took on Bendix washers, and I think the first ones were rounded, and I think Merle Streeter had one of the very first ones. And of course that was marvelous because you could put a load of laundry in and you didn't have to, you know, when my mother set up the washing machine, she had 3 other tubs and the wringer, and you were sometimes, almost everybody eventually got their hand caught in the wringer. And it would just, you know, break bones and puff everything up. It was terrible. And so when you had the automatic washers, and we had one in the, Daddy always hooked up demos in the store. So we had an automatic washer in the front of, in the front, and we did our laundry in the front. and Daddy took on Roper stoves in the late 30s. He had a Roper hooked up to gas, and he delivered bottled gas then. He took on dry gas. And they were, that was wonderful, but I cooked several meals in the front because sometimes he'd sell our stove.
In 1929, Mr. Hudson willed some money to the community, or rather to the township, for the use to build a community center. And there was provisions in his will whereby the money would not be turned over to the township until such time as the township had furnished a piece of land to set the community center on. A little story about the Mr. Hudson's reasoning for a community center was that he wanted a place for the ladies while their husbands went to the taverns. I don't know how true that is, but I've been told that. He left the money to his wife, $10,000, to be dispensed after her death, which she done. And I've heard say when we had problems with various things that maybe Mrs. Hudson should have spent it all. But she didn't. She gave the $10,000. In 1931, I believe it was, that the Jones family moved a barn from this area, and then the building was built here. In 1931 also, there was an election proposed, a referendum really, that the Hudson building have a board of its own, and it was passed. Therefore, there was a board established, and it has been run by a separate board from the township ever since.
And following World War II, my father and Harry Shaw, my father being John Mader, purchased the business from Oscar Romig and moved the location of the funeral home to 208 West Main Street, which had been Dr. Shelito's residence prior to that, or in the Shelito family. And they converted that building and added a garage to it and had the funeral home there. Of course, the furniture store stayed at this present location, or the location that we're in. And then in 1994, I bought my father out and had a new funeral home built just prior, a building for a funeral home. And my father had closed out the furniture business, well, about 1987 or 88. And
in 1963, John, my husband, bought out Harry Shaw, so we operated it from 1963 to December of 1993. And then Bill opened his place up in January of 94.
Old Dan got back in the cooler and he'd bring that meat out, and usually it was a little tainted.
Green.
Yeah, well,
They had to scrape it off.
He'd chop it up and
moldy,
and put the seasoning on it right there on the block, and then he'd grind it for you. I can remember that. I was just a little guy. You know, you're talking, excuse me, change the subject, but you were talking about Terrell's, working at Terrell's. Remember when Ty made hamburgers?
Yep.
My dad? Anyway, Dad used to give me $2 and send me over to Terrell's Market to get buns and hamburger. And we'd have enough buns and hamburgers for a Saturday night out of about $2. Of course, I think hamburgers, what, 10 or 15 cents?
Something like that.
First ones were 10 cents.
And he made the best in the country.
Yep. Put quite a bit of salt on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he used moldy things too.
Yeah.
Ty?
No, Terrell.
Oh,
No, Ty.
Oh?
Ty.
Because he would, of course, in the summertime, usually you didn't cook in the kitchen. You had a little kitchen there, and then so the frying pan, he'd have a big iron skillet and big jar of dill pickles, and they'd sit there all summer.
Refrigeration wasn't in yet.
So then when the cold weather come along, he'd say, well, we better get the kitchen ready. So he'd go back, he'd put the skillet on the stove and get it hot, and then he'd scrape the stuff out and get the scum off the pickles. And that's what he had the best hamburgers in the country, didn't he? He sure did.
I guess the municipal plant over there at the time, I first remember they were pumping water with steam pumps and manufacturing electricity with a steam engine on a turbine, dynamo, I guess they called them then, and they had a power part of the day, not every day, but in the evenings they had power on until maybe 10 o'clock at night or something, and on Mondays or some certain day, maybe it was Tuesday, they had the power on so that those that had a washer could use it and do ironing and such things as that. Chapman Engine Works. Foundry there, and they made everything for the little engine. They had the pattern makers and the people who poured the iron, and the whole business was done right there, and it was a beautiful little engine.
Yeah, Cree started that business downtown. And actually, when Cree came here, he was a Ford dealer. The man is a Ford dealer. These campers go on pickups. That's what he started building. He built those for quite a while, and then he branched out and went into just a real small trailer. And he rented another building in fact, he was in a building that was right next to me when I had my shop up on Main Street between me and Cordell Jones Law. There was a building in between me and that building, Law Building. And Cree rented that for a while, and he had part of his factory up there and the rest of it down in the old Ford garage.
I do remember John Decker, right?
Mm-hmm.
And old Charlie.
Yeah.
Hauling manure.
Yeah.
And they had a little place out to Pine Lake, as I remember, didn't they?
Yeah. Yeah. They Charlie cut hair there for many years, and John right along with him. And then after Charlie died, John continued until, I don't know, he was pretty old, about 80, I suppose, when he quit cutting hair.
Him and Dad were pretty close buddies, and I can remember one time when Dad wouldn't go down and get his hair cut down anymore. He went down one time and John was rolling dice with somebody down there, and Dad pestered him, but he wouldn't quit rolling dice to cut my dad's hair, so Dad never went back.
My son went in there one time with my father-in-law, and Clarence got his hair cut, and John asked Gary if he wanted to get his hair cut too, and Gary said no. My dad said it looks just like somebody put a bowl on your head. John said, well, that's all right. Clarence comes in here, you get yours somewhere else. We're just evened up.
What about the Wall Boys?
Oh yeah, Dan and
the meat market.
Dan and Harry,
which would be just east of the current old hotel building.
Yeah. Boy, that was some kind of place. You open the door and the smell it just almost knock you down. The meat is so strong, you know. Anyway, they survived for quite a few years in there, I guess.
Dad had sent me down there to get sausage, and Dan, he was more or less meat cutter. She'd go back in the cooler and get a bunch of pork and so forth and put her out on the block and season it and grind it.
Slobber a little tobacco juice in it.
With his derby on.
Yeah.
The linotype, I think, is known basically as the organ of the printing industry. It has so many unique noises and makes so many sounds that are peculiar only to that machine and only to the industry. It's interesting to note that when we have old printers pass through town and see them through the window, they stop in and they want to know if they can hear it run, because it does have a very unique sound.
In World War I, a young Marcellus resident by the name of Russell Wood was killed in France. And in his will, he donated $7,000 to Marcellus to create a memorial library. The village raised an additional $3,000, and in 1924, the first Russell Wood Memorial Library building was completed. For several years, the library grew, and they sort of grew out of their space, and in 1984, an addition was built on the north end of the Russell Wood building. This small fish, the bluegill, which abounds in the 30 or so lakes that surround Marcellus, became the central theme of a small local annual celebration that went on to become the National Bluegill Frolic. The first frolic was held in 1939 and developed from a much older celebration, the annual Farmers and Merchants Picnic. The frolic was dropped during the war years, but revived in the late 40s and early 50s. These scenes are the 1950 frolic, and at its peak, the celebration drew thousands of visitors from all over Michigan and surrounding states. Many floats, marching bands, vocal groups, and other types of entertainment participated in the festivities. Several Michigan governors and other legislators visited the frolic in its heyday. Governor G. Menon Soapy Williams attended the 1950 frolic, and after riding down Main Street, he crowned the 1950 Bluegill Frolic Queen.
Lizzie married G.W. and moved into this little, we call it a little house because it's so much smaller than this one, which lay right back of where I am sitting. Lizzie was a ardent Baptist, and you'll see tomorrow when you take the tour that I have some of the Baptist teacher magazines that she had. And she wanted a Baptist church. Now there was, I believe, a church over here that was a wooden church that was a Baptist church, but that also was not elaborate enough for her. Her husband G.W. gave the land for the church, and I cannot find the clipping on this. One winter they moved the frame church out and let it sit in Main Street while the other church was constructed, the one that's of the large blocks, because they couldn't figure out what to do with it.
A little bit, there was what they called a Pounds Grove. Well, people would, all the churches in the township would get together there in the summertime and have a picnic, and then they had lots of other picnics there too, but that's it.
In the 20s, there were 4 Protestant churches in town: Evangelical, United Brethren, Baptist, and Methodist. In 51, the Evangelical and United Brethren merged. The Evangelical building then was sold to the Catholics. The Baptists phased out. Now their stone building is owned by the Methodist people.
Time as I was growing up and living over this store, I met a young lady who
came to stay with her uncle and aunt who ran the hotel on the center of Main Street on the south side. And we began to play together and enjoy each other's company. And then as we got a little older, her aunt thought we could be of some help in the hotel. So we learned to clear off the tables after people had eaten, and then to reset the tables for new guests. And then in '33, Carol and I were married. And during our lifetime, we lived in Marcellus, and then we lived in the house that the Richard Ingersolls live in now. And then my parents had sold this business to John Mader and Harry Shaw.
What we should talk about is some of the town characters.
Well, you're two of them.
How about
Ty had a big family
Right
though, you
there.
know what?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody knew Ty.
That's where we first met John Blow. He came in one night, Jim Blow was about that high, and John had
Is that what's called?
Norma Sisson's
Oh, okay.
husband, John Blow. And he had a cigar box, and he handed it to your mother, Catherine Coburn. And he said, "Catherine, would you mind keeping this for us for a little while?" And she said, "Yes, I'll put it up here on the soda fountain counter." And John disappeared with Jim. And after he got out the door, Catherine peeked in it and had a pint of whiskey in it. I think that was during moonshine days or something, was it?
No, not after.
No.
After the war, wasn't it?
But I thought that was funny. Prohibition days were something else, Jim.
Oh, yeah. That's when everybody's making
moonshine.
You go to somebody's house and everything, you hear some boom!
Home brew.
You blow the clock.
Home brew. Something blew up in the basement.
That was something, wasn't it? That was something.
They think the kids are bad now.
Oh, yeah.
It's out in the open now.
And then, of course, next was Dad's pool room. And so that was our downfall. That's where I was the champion swearer at that time.
That was the den of inequity in the town of Marcellus.
Oh.
Your kids didn't hang out there because that was a bad place.
All the
That's where you learned all.
and all the mothers, thought that was terrible.
And there were a couple of game rooms. There was Ty Colburn's and Hartshorn's. And woe be to anybody in our family that went in there. They probably got licked when they got home.
And one of the things we used to go down here to the Creamery Creek, and we'd cut watercress, sell it to the A&P store. Another thing we used to, in the spring, we used to go around and clean up people's ash piles for them and haul them down the dump. One thing that myself, a person named Bob Michael, used to do, we'd crawl underneath the co-op down here, and the grain and stuff that went through the floor, we'd sack it up and sell it for chicken feed.
Had to chase the rats.
Yeah, I had to chase the rats on the way, but fight them for it. Now another thing we did was these coal cars, you have to shovel the coal off. I think it was 60 ton of coal on a car. And two people could do it in a day. It seemed like we got $6 or $7 for shoveling a carload of coal off. Then we used to go down and pick up corn cobs down here at the co-op. People used to use them to start fire in their wood stoves with. They put a little kerosene on them and throw them in there. And some people used to burn them all the time. People didn't have a whole lot.
Well, they started in playing. Hank was from Marcellus, and this man here was from Niles, and this one was from over by DeWodjack. After the kids come, he just went and played for dances on Saturday nights, and I didn't work anymore after that. We went out to Fish Lake and played out there to that pavilion. It was across the street from where the Melville's place was.
Well, my father never owned a car, but my brother was home and he owned a car, so Father was going to drive it one time, and I guess he drove through the end of the barn and yelled, "Whoa!" That was the last time. He never had any desire to have a car.
But the ice business at that time was pretty big because very few people had refrigerators. And for several years after the war, they weren't available.
That's
then
right.
It died pretty fast too. About 1950, 49, 50 was probably the end of the ice business. But the major money maker when we were kids was out at the muck farm.
The muck farm.
Weeding onions and carrots, and Ed Bainbridge and
Well, there was a whole bunch of them. We had Goodspeed, we had Burlews, and
Kleins.
So we weren't out of a place to work. You'd only make maybe $1 a day or $1.50 a day.
Well,
I was talking about $1 a day. Well, I went out to Burlews. I don't know. I must have been about 10 years old or something like that. And right on the corner there was a long field. I mean, you could look and look and look, and all it was a bunch of onions growing down through there. And he said, "Well, what you're going to get is $1 a row."
$1? No,
A row.
John, no. I don't think you ever got $1 a row.
Yep, we did out there. But I never got through the row in a whole day. I mean, there was weeds. These weeds were. The field was let go for a while. You remember they took that little. Yeah, they took that little color pack and went down to the middle of the thing. Mulcher, and then all right. So you had to take your fingers and go like this. And I figured, well, I'd get probably about 4 or 5 of those rows that day. I didn't even get that whole row done, and I had to go back on it. That was $1 a row. But then they changed the. Well, and you weren't in the same field as I was at that time.
Well, I remember out at Ed Bainbridge's, they measured the rows in rods, and a 40-rod row, and a rod is 16.5 feet. So a 40 rod is whatever that
Quite
is.
a bit of feet, yeah.
You got 10 cents a row, and a 60 rod row, you got 15 cents.
That's right.
And the pickle factory, that was another
that was a good
business
one
that we all got involved in.
Bert McDonald.
Bert McDonald ran the pickle factory. And they'd contract out the farmers to bring in pickles. They had these huge vats that they put the pickles in. So if you worked there, your job was to put salt on they'd bring in train cars full of salt. So you had to unload the salt, throw it on top of the pickles, and then they had a sorter that sorted
it graded it. Yeah, as a grader, yeah.
And, so you'd truck the pickles into the right barrel and then salt them down. I can't remember what we got paid for that.
Well, I don't know, but they didn't pay me enough money for what I'd done at the end, because at the end they had to clean the big the storage barrels out, and I was in on that operation. Red Drake, and I don't know who else was down there, but when we got down to the bottom of the thing, there was about that much the rats and mice, and there was all underneath the pickles. And I was saying, well, yeah, well, see what happened. Well, they'd come in and they'd jump into the vats, and it was a kind of a mess to clean that out. But they paid us fairly well, you know. I mean, but it was quite a. But like I say, those were our main objectives, as I remember back then, is trying to figure out how you could make just a few pennies
Oh, there was always some way to make money. Another way was picking
Yeah.
elderberries.
Oh, but
And elderberries used to grow along all the roads around here.
yeah.
And so we'd go out and pick elderberries and sold them to a guy named Max
Booth.
And I don't know, he took them to someplace where they made wine, I guess, or juice or something.
Well, that generally that was always the money we took over to the Centerville Fair, and now there's another good thing.
And they also, he killed chickens.
Yeah. Well, Drake's took that over.
Took that business over.
You remember our first bowling alley in Marcellus?
It was about the same place.
Yeah. Well, it's where Johnny's Pizzeria is right now.
Right in there.
That was a job. That was a good job. But the only problem with that job was there's a big problem. I would have had 3 lanes or something like that in there. I was setting pins in there.
Pins.
And I think 8 cents a line or something like that, but you took your life in your hand. Because I'd walk in there and get behind that thing, and those pins, you had to set them by hand. There was none of this dump them in stuff. They were little pegs or something, you set them on, and then you got up out of the way after you set the pins. You set the pins, and here standing at the end is old Chuck Abrams. I'm looking up at the end of the thing, and here Chuck, he's got this little ball about that big around. I said, what's he going to do, throw it or roll it? And I'm back there, and you go, move. And then there was Bowers and all them. They'd come in there. I think they'd just come in there to punish us, to see just if they could knock us off our little stool back in there. And them pins would fly all over. Sometimes you'd have to go back and maybe pick up a half a pin and replace it with, and they'd sit out there and they'd be banging, get the pins going, you know.
Always something going on.
Always something moving on.